Welcome to Friday afternoon at the Manor. My name is Joseph Mastandrea. And again, just reminding you, we're here either by Zoom or you can come here in person and enjoy a light lunch with my favorite main course being pizza. Now, we have a great treat today with Jim Harbell, but to welcome you to our wonderful event, we'll be having Susan Johnson come to our the podium here. And again, over to you, Susan.
Thank you very much. Thank you everyone for coming. As he mentions, our speaker is Jim Harbell. He'll be talking about his work with providing housing for affordable housing for people with criminal records. You know, housing is rough enough in Toronto and Ontario, even at the best of times. If you've got that strike against you, it's even more difficult. So Jim.
I do not know how to do that. No.
You want to make sure you have focus. And so this should have done it right at the beginning. That way we have you as the good.
Great. Hello, everybody, and thanks very much to John Joseph for inviting me and for Susan for that introduction. So we're going to talk for a few minutes this afternoon about a cause that's very near and dear to my heart, and that is housing for people who have come out of prison. So I'm just going to pull up, we've got a PowerPoint here. So I think that's okay. I may need Nina's help here, but maybe not. Share screen. There you go. There we go. Share. From the beginning. There we go. Nice. All right. Excellent. How's that looking at home? Is that looking like we've got the screen up okay?
Just put a thumbs up, everybody, from your end.
Can see it just fine.
Terrific. That's great. So I am the head of an organization called Restorative Justice Housing Ontario. We are a brand new startup charity formed in the last 3 to 4 years. How it came about is that a group of us went to a conference on restorative justice about 4 or 5 years ago. And part of that conference involved people with lived experience, both men and women, talking about what it was like to move from prison, transitioning back into the community. And they talked about trying to find employment. They talked about trying to find connections with people. But the topic that resonated with us the most was that they talked about housing. They said that if you're in a shelter, you have very few belongings, you can't get mail, it's very hard to get a job, it's destabilizing, people may steal from you, it may make you ill, you don't eat very well, and the likelihood, and some of them shared this lived experience, is that they would then just circle back into the prison system. So a number of us sort of thought about this and started to go out and talk to people. We talked to Corrections Canada, we talked to folks in the province, we talked to other organizations such as John Howard to try to understand, okay, so what's going on out there? Why are these folks having a tough time finding housing? And what we found out was that there really wasn't a housing agency out there that focused on the folks that are coming directly out of prison. And here is some of the information that we found that we kind of kept into account. So for example, 10,000 people are released from either the provincial jail system or the federal penitentiary system into just the GTA each year. Of those, about 30% of them don't have a safe, stable place to live. So they head immediately into the the system of shared beds and out onto the streets if they don't think that it's safe. So that's 3,000 people a year who need housing, who come from a very specific and highly vulnerable group. And we all know what's been happening with the Toronto housing market with affordable housing. The vacancy rates are low, and it's been incredibly hard for anybody to find housing. So what happens when somebody who comes out of prison tries to find housing? Well, some of you who may have that experience, you get a form from the landlord, and you have to fill out the form. It includes your income, it includes where you've previously lived. And the landlord in Ontario is allowed to ask, do you have a criminal record? So what do you think happens when 10 or 15 people apply for the same apartment and somebody has checked the box that they've got a criminal record? Because of course you can check that. You can find out if somebody has lied on that form. They probably also don't have a previous landlord. They maybe haven't got their Ontario Works in place yet, or they don't have a job yet. Right, so their likelihood of winning a place to stay in a tight market is incredibly low. And as I've said, without this housing, they are much more likely to reoffend. So that's where we came in. We decided we would take the plunge and form Restorative Justice Housing Ontario with the purpose of two goals. One, to actually provide the transition housing for folks coming particularly from federal penitentiary. We decided that we would work with the crowd that were the hardest to house. So if you've been in penitentiary for 10, 15, a couple of our residents have been there for 25 years, they are an incredibly difficult group of people to house. So that's the group that we have started with. So our first order of business is to actually provide them housing. But the second and equally important part of what we're doing is a public benefit, because if these folks stay stable and in housing, then they're less likely to reoffend, which means that there are fewer victims and they're not back into an incredibly costly system. So what do? We kind of created ourselves as the middleman, if you will. So we deal with the landlords. We've gone out and rented houses. We're still very small, but we've rented houses. We've got two. Third one we're just finishing one up and in transition. So 5-bedroom houses where we've done the deal with the landlord, and then we have an occupancy agreement with each of the folks that are coming in to live. And this occupancy agreement means, for example, no alcohol, no drugs, some shared dining experiences, keeping the place clean, being respectful to your neighbors, right? To the other folks that are living in the house. So we do the arrangement with the resident, and in turn, we have the financial responsibility to the landlord. The other part of what we're doing is that most of our residents are on Ontario Works, which means that they've got $400, $500, $600 a month that gets allocated to housing. So we're all here in the kind of Toronto area. Can you imagine trying to find a place to live for $400, $500, or $600? So what we do is that we go rent a house that might be $2,500, something like that, for a full house somewhere. The resident puts in what they can, because we want them to have what we call skin in the game. If they're going to transition into community, then it's important for them to understand what it's like to pay rent. So they pay us rent based on what they can afford to pay us. And then we use the charitable donations that we receive to pay the difference. So we are getting them from what might be an unsafe rooming house into a safe, secure house in a decent neighborhood, close to transit, close to places that they might be able to get out to work, close to food stores, with the likelihood that will allow them then to more clearly transition into community. So why did we use the name restorative justice? Well, a number of you will know, and I'm just going to read this one. It's a way of approaching the impact of crime and wrongdoing that focuses not only on the crime that's being committed, who is responsible, and the penalty that they must pay, but it also focuses on who has been hurt and what are their needs, what relationships have been broken, and who is responsible to begin to make things as right as possible. So it looks at the needs of the victims as well as the needs of the offenders and tries to bring the two together. So we've called ourselves Restorative Justice Housing because, yes, the housing is for the offenders as they move back into the community, but it's also important for the community representing the victims to hold our residents to account. They have, in fact, had a reason why it was that they were in prison. They need to, in a caring and compassionate way, understand how the community responds to them as a result of their wrongdoing. And we're assisting that transition by working with them for the 4 years, so they can stay with us for upwards of 4 years. So we'll work with them with individual counseling, group sessions. We have people from faith groups that are journeying with our folks to have them understand what the community's understanding is about what's happened to them. So that's where the name restorative justice comes in. There is an element of forgiveness. And I will say to you, this is the one slide I have with a picture and somebody's name and a face on it. I am incredibly reluctant to show pictures of our residents for reasons that I hope you understand. So we try to ensure that they live peacefully in the community and get a chance to actually get on their feet without a lot of publicity towards them. So here are some of the values that I've been talking about a little bit that I wanted to include for you to have an understanding of the restorative justice values and beliefs. And for example, in the Globe this week, some of you may have seen that there was an attack by a teenager on a Jewish community center in Victoria. And there was graffiti scrawled across the wall, hateful graffiti, by what turned out to be a 15-year-old. And she had issues going on in her life that were reported in the paper that caused her to take these steps. And the court, rather than simply sentencing her, took a restorative justice approach of putting her in a journey of full communication with the Jewish Community Center, which eventually resulted in a letter seeking forgiveness, apologizing for her actions that went out to all the folks that were part of the community center. So that's the nature of the type of restoration that we're talking about. A couple of stats here, I'll go through this fairly quickly, but this is the public side of what we're doing. You can see, I'll turn to this next one here. The costs are enormous. So the public side of tax dollars that go in to dealing with victims, correctional costs, the court costs, keeping somebody in prison, right? For somebody who is in federal custody, they can have total costs of millions of dollars so if we can keep these folks well stable into the community, the savings to the system is enormous, which of course causes us to ask the question, well, wouldn't we be better as a community if we were spending more money on housing and less money on prisons? And what is it that we can do about that? How can we work with people to not have them cycle through the system as much as they can? And as faith communities, what are we called upon to do to try to work with folks who are in this position, to keep them here, to keep them in a position where they feel like they've got a reason to get up in the morning and get out of bed and get going. So it's a calling that we've been wondering about. And it's of no surprise that our initial funders were faith communities who already understood that we are called, as Jesus has said to us, to minister to all, to support all. And Jesus specifically ministered to those who were in prison. And so we are finding that faith communities understand the journey that we're on and are helpful in providing support. So I'm going to tell you a little story just to kind of give you a feel for who we're dealing with. So we got a phone call about a year and a half ago from a woman from the John Howard Society. She said, I've had a phone call from a woman in Miami. Her brother is just getting out of jail in the US, and he's been turned over to the US border system, and they want to deport him to Canada, but he has no connection to Canada. Could you try to help, because we don't have housing that we can help, and this man's going to need an address. So we had our folks talk to the woman who turned out to be the sister of the man who was in prison. And his story was that his parents had left Colombia when he was, before he was born. They made their way to Canada, and he was born in Canada. And he was born in Canada, but left Canada when he was 6 and moved with his family to the United States. But he never had US citizenship. So long story short, he ends up in trouble, in jail for 14 or 15 years in a US jail. Now he's been released from jail. He served his full time. And the US authorities went, you're not an American citizen. We're going to deport you to your place of citizenship. That happened to be Canada, and he had absolutely no connection. So what did we do? We actually then started talking to the US Border Services. We provided them with our address and a commitment that he would have a roof over his head if they would release him. And some of you may have heard this story, some of it was in the news. He was in a dormitory in with the US Border Patrol dormitory, 80 to 100 men in one room during COVID. No protection at this point. It was ahead of when there were any vaccines. He was seriously at risk at that point of serious health issues. And his sister was frantic to get him out of there and to get him somewhere safe. So a longer story short, the fact that we were able to provide him with an address meant that 3 weeks after the conversations with the US border authorities began, he was in Toronto in quarantine at an airport hotel and moved in with us. So there is and he turned out to be just an incredible resident, and he has already moved on. So he was 18 months with us, and he's now transitioned into more permanent housing. He made connections. He got a job. He was able to get his life together by having a stable roof over him. So the slide up here about why can't former prisoners find safe housing? Significant part of it is stigma. That the landlords that we've talked about, the fear, and particularly with the folks who have been in federal penitentiary for a number of years, the fear of the kinds of crimes that they have gone through can be fairly significant. But these are, in our case, they've been men so far. We choose them because we know that they are seeking forgiveness, that they see the benefit of living in community. They've had many years to ponder, to pray about what happened, why it happened, what was going on in their life. And they come to us with a commitment that they want to change. So our goals for 2021 is just to kind of give you a sense of where we are. So we are looking to create partnerships with faith communities. We've had some, it's been tough, I will tell you that, trying to get a housing agency set up where our first residents came in a couple of months before COVID. So we haven't been able to provide the day-to-day support that we would like to do. We've been able to train volunteers. They have special training to deal with the group of people that they are dealing with. We have been able to do some community events such as outdoor barbecues where that's been safe. Our residents are vaccinated, so we've been able to provide them with that safety. So we're working on with volunteers, and we are hoping as COVID conditions now allow for more activity to take place, that we will bring people together more so than we've done. So our volunteers so far might meet somebody for a coffee outside of Tim Hortons. They might take them to the grocery store. They might attend one of our barbecues, but we'd like to see more happening there. And we're looking to have our volunteers perhaps be part of a community that also provides us with funding, because we can see that there is that kind of direct connection is really helpful. We're in, as I mentioned, we have our 2 houses are in South Etobicoke. So Mimico, nice, safe area. The couple of local churches down there have been providing us with really good support. We now need to diversify. So we're moving our 3rd house from down there up to kind of the North York area. And then we're about to open a 4th house, we hope, to provide support for women. Why did we start with men first? Some of you might be wondering. Because women do a whole lot better at keeping their network in place while they're in prison. They actually stay in touch with their families. They stay better in touch with their friends. So when they come out, their likelihood of having to couch surf or go to a shelter is considerably lower than men. Men tend to get angry, obviously broad generalizations. They blow up their networks. Some of them have been there for a very long time. They come out alone. They frequently have no support. The women tend to have better support. And the prison population is generally about 3/4 men, 1/4 women in this country. So we're hoping to get a 4th unit open for women. We need to provide female support. So we have a staff person at the moment who works very part-time to support the men. He is somebody who has been in prison. So he has the same lived experience in part that our male residents have. The women who need housing, we have investigated, frequently have a trauma history. They frequently have a trauma history that has a man involved in it or more than one. And so we're going to be looking to hire a woman to support the women's accommodation to make sure that they feel as safe as they possibly can in this accommodation. So we are moving in that direction through 2021. And finally, I'll just end with what our mission is: to provide safe, stable, affordable housing that gives former prisoners the stable foundation they need to become positive members in their communities. This leads to safe neighborhoods and lower reoffense rates. So thank you very much. I'm for inviting me today, and I'm going to open it up to any questions that anybody may have.
Well, I'll jump in first. So when you mentioned that, you said church people have friends or advocates. So is that similar to the Mennonite circle where you have circles of accompaniment?
Yeah, it is. And of our directors, do you want me to stop screen sharing here?
Yeah, that's good.
Stop share. There we go. Several of our directors, including me, are members of COSA and have journeyed with people. COSA, for those of you who don't know, is a specific organization that supports sex offenders, particularly sex offenders for minors. And so it's an incredibly difficult population to journey with. A number of us have done that and have in mind that kind of journeying. That is not a population that restorative justice at this point is serving. They need help. We haven't been able to figure out how to do that yet. And so we are working with the more general prison population as they come out at this point. It's a significant issue to safely place a house in a neighborhood, right, and to be able to deal with the neighbors and to be able to say to them, we know that the group of people that we are placing here among you will add to your neighbors. They'll be safe. They will actually be an asset to the neighborhood. And our guys so far have shown that. They'll offer gardening. They'll have a senior next door that they're shoveling the snow for. They are so desirous of getting into community and being part of it. So that nature of journeying alongside of them is on a different scale than COSA. It's a lighter scale, a lighter touch. This group doesn't need that same level of assistance. They're happy to kind of have a coffee with somebody, spend an hour talking to them about what it's like to be back in community.
Now, what we might probably want to do is keep an eye, does anybody on Zoom, because I was paying more attention to people on Zoom with their hand up or something. So you might want to sit down here, Susan, if you have a question.
My one is obvious because, Toronto is infamous for being very protective of its neighborhoods. And so have you found any hurdles there, or were they able to come around to understand?
Yeah, so we're trying to find a balance, Susan. It's a really hard question what you've asked. We're trying to find a balance between letting the nearby neighbors know a little bit about who's moving in, protecting the privacy of the men who are moving in. But we have decided not to do a broadcast into the neighborhood because we think that out of fear, perhaps a misplaced fear, that people will become angry, they'll become scared, and they will make life quite difficult for us. And because these people, we're not a halfway house, and maybe I should have been clear about that. The folks that we have living with us are free to live anywhere in the community. So if there was a place down the street that was for rent, if they could afford it and the landlord said it was okay, they could move in there. They're no longer controlled by Corrections Canada.
Because I know we have, still have shelter from the homeless, a sort of transition. And the beginning the neighborhood was, of course, a gas children. And then some other parents have stepped up and said, hey, look, this is a problem. Go away, let's teach our kids how to deal with it.
Right.
So that they did step up and be very supportive.
And I think the point that you've just raised is a really important one, to educate people about what's going on. And part of it is helpful for us to be able to say to the neighbors, we have faith groups who are journeying alongside us. So folks that are in the community are here in and out of the house, helping, supporting, and that the men who are living in the house can text somebody if they have something that comes up that they need to talk to somebody about. So one of the people that I journeyed with, he was trying to find a job. He would text me before most job interviews or want to FaceTime so that he could discuss with me what he was going to wear. Right. And you know what? He just needed somebody to talk to about that. I'm going to this kind of a job interview. Do I need to wear a tie? I've got one tie, that should I put it on? Right. And that's just folks living together in community, right? Needing to talk to people about everyday things.
So Jim, just to clarify, so initially you talked about having houses that are purchased by organizations, or rented, sorry.
Rented, yep.
And so is the idea that people can live in those houses, or is that just a gathering point?
Yeah, no, these are houses people are living in. So we're renting 4 or 5 bedroom houses. A resident has their own room. So they've got the ability to put their own things in there and know that they're safe and going to be protected. And then they share the kitchen and the living area and the TV. And so they live similar to how a family may live, right? But each with their own space. And what we won't really appreciate is if you've been in prison for 20 years, where you have had no privacy, no ability to put your own things somewhere and know that it might be there when you come back, that small touch is so important for them. And privacy is something they have to learn to live with a little bit. We take it for granted, but they're relearning that. And sometimes it doesn't go quite as easily as you might think, because somebody might decide to just go into the room of the guy next door and he's going to be a little alarmed by that. So things that we take for granted, we're training people, our volunteers, to say, you know what, you might actually need to think about that, right, as part of your walking with this person.
So related to that, I guess would be also a sense of, you talked about what to wear in an interview. You'd be helping people with resume writing as well.
Yeah.
And searching how to go about a job search. Which platform to look at.
And so we've been working with a group called Friends of Dismiss, who you may have heard of, which is a group that's been supporting people coming out of prison and their families and people who are in prison for 20 or 25 years. And they have a program to support people getting employment and how to write resumes. 2 or 3 of us are directors of Dismiss as well as this, because there's not a lot of people who are willing to work in this area. So we work closely with them to do just as you said. And we hope that the volunteers that are working with our residents, that they might be able to help. They might look at a draft letter that somebody is sending along with a resume and give somebody some comments, the same way you might ask a friend to do that.
It's interesting because you're probably familiar with, I think it's Concert Properties, condo people. If I understand correctly, they employ people who have a past record and will help train them to develop those skills. Is that still the case?
I'm not sure about Concert, but I do know there are, particularly in the construction business, that there are companies who have made it a part of their mission to allow people to get a decent job, because they're good paying jobs, and to properly train them and to support them, because something might go wrong. Like if you've been in jail for 20 years and you're coming out, you may well make a misstep. Right. And that misstep might even land you back in jail for a couple of days. So we've had some of our folks that have done that. We understand that. We welcome them back. And if you're an employer where that's happened, you need to be sufficiently flexible to know that this may not be smooth sailing. And that those kinds of issues, the forgiveness slide kicks in. Yes, you weren't at work last week. Something went wrong, but you're back here now and you're committed to trying to move forward.
So I want to ask Susan and Betty. So I was part of the, I think you call it Circle of Friends to the Mennonite former sex offenders several years ago.
Yep. And
the idea with that program, you had sometimes 4 or 5 people meeting, I think it was monthly.
Yep.
With the person. And the idea is you check in, and sometimes individually you meet people for coffee. Now, with this program, do people have a buddy who's a volunteer? What term do you use for that?
Friend comes to mind.
Okay.
It's an intentional friend. All right. That so our plan pre-COVID was that we would have a group of people support each house, so that not necessarily one-on-one relationships, but a group of 6 people that support the 4 people living in this house. And they would kind of come in and make relationships among the 4 residents, so that it doesn't equate the intensity of the one-on-one relationship, because there are pros and cons to that. And that's why COSA uses the group relationship too, because that seems to be a healthier way to allow people to transition, is by meeting a group of people and having to learn to interact with different people.
How long are people allowed to live in that house? Is there a time limit or?
Yeah, so 4 years is the time limit. Yeah, so there is a section under Ontario's legislation that allows for transition housing up to 4 years. And so far we've now been operating for a couple of years, a little more. We've had 4 or 5 people anyway who have already transitioned. A couple have transitioned into seniors housing. A couple have transitioned. In one case, one man found a girlfriend from 25 years ago and they reconnected, and he now has a home. And so some lovely things potentially happening. It's quite heartwarming to see.
But it's with the donations. Is there an arm of your organization plus fundraising?
We're not big enough to have arms, but we've got a group. We've got the finger, exactly. So we have a fundraising committee who are out fundraising. And our first funder was Catholic Charities, who had what we were doing, particularly with prisoners, as part of their mission. And they gave us funding before we had a house, before they said, we like the idea, go try to do it. We trust you, we believe in you. And that was fantastic. And the fact that they have supported us has now opened up other funders who've said, okay, well, if you've made your way through that process and they've given you more money, then that's good credibility, and we'd like to help you.
This is, do you have any more questions?
I think basically it's covered.
Okay. And Betty is always full of lots of questions. Betty, do you have a question?
Sorry, just a little tired today, so not too many ideas.
Okay, that is asked. What about Susan Logie? Did you have a question?
I was wondering if there's any spiritual component to this, to your support.
So not overtly, but it is part of the volunteers and board of directors. So we have in common among the board that we're all spiritual. We are of different denominations, and that has been a good thing. And we are responsive to what the resident is looking for. So some of the residents are looking for strong spiritual support. Some of them did find God while they were in prison and are looking for a way to support that. Others have questions and they're just wondering, and they want somebody to just talk to them over coffee about some of those questions. Some of our residents, we have a mix. So our population is on average about 40% non-white, and it is split between Muslim, Christian, non-religious. So it matches a little bit of what the population is in Toronto in its diversity. And so one of the things that we've been doing is that we brought in some folks to help us with diversity, to kind of understand how do we work with religious diversity, how do we work with other forms of diversity to make sure that we are as welcoming and as hospitable as we possibly can, because we are providing home for these folks.
Do they have access to a computer in their home?
Yes, so some of them save up their money and get an iPad. We've had a couple of computers donated. Those are particularly helpful for job hunting, keeping up with the news, maybe watching a movie, a variety of different reasons that we would use a computer, they would use a computer. So yes, we, and in each of the houses have internet so that they've got that available to them to support their lives. We also encourage people, particularly the men, to start to reconnect. So if they can reconnect with family or with friends, they can use the computer then to do that. They can text, or they can send an email, or and some of them, like, they come out and they've actually never seen an iPhone. Like, I know we'll kind of think, well, but if somebody's been in prison for 20 years, technology has changed considerably, because they certainly didn't have access while they were in prison. So that's part of what a volunteer is sometimes helping with, is just tech support in the simplest of ways, right? Just because that's kind of part of what it's like to live in community.
Do they have cell phones?
Most of them have a cell phone, yes.
Okay.
That's probably the first thing that if they get a bit of money, that they'll put their money toward. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So another question. Oh, do any of them need, or maybe it was available in the prison, I don't know, like AA or NA or?
Yeah, so as I mentioned, we're dry houses, but some of them do need AA, and there is an AA meeting place not far from where the houses are relatively close together. And there's an AA there. It happens to be in the church basement of a church that's been providing us with support. So some of their outreach volunteers and their minister have been involved. So that's kind of working well, as trying to develop a little bit of a comfortable relationship to the physical space so that they feel comfortable getting out to an AA meeting.
Right.
So how does one go about volunteering with your organization? As an online application, if you want
Yep.
volunteer.
So there's an online application. We have a volunteer coordinator, and we train people before anybody does anything. So we interview somebody and we train them as to what we're all about, what are the population is about, what the potential issues may be, the kinds of things that they're going to potentially raise. So we do that training, and then we move people into working in groups with our residents.
Do they need things like just basic life skills? Do they know how to cook or wash their own clothes, or did they learn that kind of stuff in prison?
So most of them, it's a good question. Cooking seems to vary considerably, but they all kind of cook for themselves. We would like to have been able to provide more assistance on that, but with COVID, you can't send a volunteer into somebody else's kitchen. I mean, that just hasn't been open to do that for the last 18 months. The washing seems to happen. From the best that we figure out is they help each other. And we actually think, right, because there's kind of two different levels of community playing out here. There's the community, the broader community that we want these folks to learn to live within, but we also think it's important that they live as a community. And sometimes there are conflicts, and we hope that they can figure that out the way any other kind of family or group of people who are living together needs to figure out. So trying to support them to live within their own community is also part of what we do. Our staff person, he does spend a fair bit of time with them on that topic. Because they don't naturally live in their own community easily, right? They've been wary, right? They've had their back against a wall for 20 years, just protecting themselves from, I mean, prison is a traumatic experience. And so these are folks that basically have some level of trauma as they're moving in with us, and they bring that with them. And so you have to very kind of carefully work with them to give them the support to learn to trust to live with somebody else.
Do you have anybody that teaches them? I can't do this, but I did in a church in Colorado. There was a guy who was a longtime practitioner, certified or whatever in nonviolent communication, you know, which does help with obviously conflict resolution, real or imagined.
Yeah, so funny you should say it. So we are just in the process of seeking specific training from that. It used to be called St. Christopher's House. It's now called something else. They have specialists in that area. So we've actually got our whole board signed up, as well as our staff person, to each do this training, because we're a very hands-on board. Some of our board members have been chaplains in the area for 30, 40 years, either in prisons or organizations related to it. So we're there with the residents, and frequently, because we haven't been able to get volunteers as much as we would like over the last 18 months because of COVID, the directors have been doing the volunteering of various kinds, which actually also includes evictions. Like we have boundaries. And if somebody breaches those boundaries, if that means that the house is no longer safe for the other residents, then we have eviction provisions, and we've had to use them, and we will use them, because our overall mission is a safe place for somebody to live. So I've done at least one eviction, which didn't go terribly well, but didn't go terribly badly either. But we are a frontline group, shall I say.
But didn't that, in the end, I would imagine it would make the other, let's say, 4 residents feel safer?
It did, and that's why we did it. It doesn't necessarily mean that the actual activity of evicting somebody goes smoothly.
Well, no, and it's probably never pleasant.
Yeah. And because when we're evicting somebody, we're likely sending them to a shelter.
Right. Or
Like
the streets even, right?
or the street. Yeah. So one of our residents was living, these storage units that you can kind of rent.
Yeah,
Where people put stuff that they don't want to give away yet, but they can't fit in their house. So one of our residents was living in a storage unit, and we did a temporary eviction of him until we could de-escalate a situation, and he went back to the storage unit to live. And so what the right thing is to do, but it's a whole lot harder when you know how hard the consequences are going to be for somebody if we take away their housing.
right. But they also clearly must know the rules too.
They do. We explain the rules to them, and we give them second chances. Like we're not we even give third chances sometimes, depending on what the issue is. So if
Right.
it's alcohol, we're a little bit more easy to deal with. No, beyond, say a third chance and then you're done. If it's something that is potentially involving, say, something like a knife, something that goes to personal safety, then one chance and you're gone. If I had known what it was going to be like to set up and manage this organization, I'm not sure we would have done it. It's not for the faint of heart, but the stories of the successes keep you going. Because you do see people who are coming back now and telling us that they're in community and they're happy and they seem adjusted and they're connected and they get jobs and personal relationships, and so that's why we do it.
Does that encourage the present residents?
It does. Yeah. It's just, as I mentioned, because the population trauma has been such a significant part of their lives coming into this, they don't always behave to start off with in a way that you and I might think of as the rational approach. And we recognize, and we have people who have got mental health expertise that are either part of our advisory group or on our board, so who we can call upon to get some support, to know that that may well be the trauma talking and not the person, and that you need to kind of cut them some slack and find them some support. So we've sent people out to CAMH and related similar groups who can provide people with some of this support.
Do they get mental health help with their PTSD?
So we've been making referrals to people to provide the mental health support. They don't get it in prison, unfortunately. So they kind of come out the way they are. And some deal way better with it than others. Kind of depends on your history going in.
Right. Well, I admire you for doing this. I'm sure it's tough.
I'm joined by an incredible group of people. It's an amazing group to be part of. We are all very supportive of one another and have learned by it. So our collective learning over the last 3 years has been very helpful.
Yeah, you could not do it alone, I'm certain.
No, no. Yeah,
Yeah, I taught centering prayer in a couple of prisons or county jails in Colorado, and went with at least one other man weekly. And that alone was sometimes challenging enough. But it wasn't a maximum security because they wouldn't have allowed it, but it was a minimum or medium.
yeah. So our folks will have made their way down to at least a medium by the time they're released. I mean, the system does allow, it does try to make sure that, you know, if they're coming out, say after 20 years, and frequently their parole then is into a halfway house. So there's a halfway house here in Toronto and the kind of central West End. We work with them. They're a referral agency basically to us of people that need housing. Once they've completed their parole and are free to be part of the community. So that's part of, we talk to them. We also talk to prison chaplains. So because we do go through quite a rigorous interviewing process. It's not for everybody that they will want the style of housing that we're providing and the support that we're providing. So we want people who will benefit from living in community, and we try to figure that out through our interview process. So we would accept probably 1 in 2 of applicants, and we still have a fairly long waiting list at this point.
How long are people on parole?
It depends on how long their sentence was. Right, and so the parole system is, they could be on parole for upwards of 18 months. They could also be on parole for just a couple of months.
Oh, okay. And then how often do they have to see their parole officer?
So that varies too. As soon as they've left prison, it's usually weekly. And then if everything is going well, that can go to bi-weekly and then to monthly. It's usually at least monthly through the parole period. And that would only be kind of towards the end when everybody kind of feels that this is a stable relationship at this point.
Right. Do they get in prison, like if someone's bipolar, for example, do they get, I don't know, lithium or whatever provided in prison?
I think it varies. So the stories that I hear are kind of depending on the circumstances and the prison. Sometimes they get that kind of medical assistance. There usually had to have been a fairly dramatic episode that would have brought the person's need to the attention of the authorities to get the medical intervention. If you're kind of quietly living in pain, that may not get as well supported. But if you've had a psychotic event, for example, that has sent you to the prison doctor, then at that point, yes, they will provide pharmaceutical support.
Okay.
Okay. Thank you, everybody who came, and thank you, Jim. And we begin to bring our time to a close. We're going to bring Susan back to the podium, who will offer thanks.
Thank you, everyone, for coming. Next week, our speaker will be the Reverend Dr. Sherry DeNovo, who will talk about what it was like growing up gay in Toronto in the 1960s. So I hope you'll be able to join us.
And thank you again, everybody. Have a good rest of the day. May have a wonderful Thanksgiving. Bye-bye for now.